Before we begin, let me ask you a quiet question. What happens when science no longer asks why, and only asks how far? Throughout history, humanity has celebrated scientific progress as proof of enlightenment. Vaccines, medicine, technology, all symbols of hope. But science by itself is morally silent. It does not choose good or evil. It only follows direction. In the early 20th century, a group of highly trained doctors, scientists, and military officers believed they were serving their nation. They worked with microscopes, test tubes, and carefully organized charts. They wore white coats, not uniforms stained with blood. Their language was precise, their methods systematic, their intentions, at least in their own minds, rational. And yet, what they built would later be described as one of the darkest chapters in human history. Tonight, on The Myth Echoes, this is not a story meant to shock you. It is a story meant to disturb you in a quieter way. Because the most frightening thing about Unit 731 is not simply what happened behind its walls, but how ordinary the people inside believed their work to be. This is a story about science without conscience, about obedience without reflection, and about how easily morality can disappear when responsibility is passed upward and never questioned. To understand Unit 731, we must first understand its world. In the 1930s, Imperial Japan was not merely a nation at war. It was an empire expanding rapidly across East Asia, driven by ideology, fear, and ambition. The world itself was unstable. The memory of World War I was still fresh, and nations had learned a dangerous lesson. Modern war was no longer decided solely by soldiers on battlefields. Technology mattered, industry mattered, and increasingly, science mattered. European powers had already experimented with chemical weapons. Poison gas had reshaped warfare into something impersonal and terrifying. Japan's military leadership believed that future conflicts would not be won by strength alone, but by scientific superiority. Biological and chemical warfare were seen as the next frontier. But beneath these strategic calculations was a deeper, more troubling belief that individuals could be sacrificed for what was described as the survival of the state. In this environment, morality became flexible. Language changed. People were no longer described as individuals, but as populations, resources, variables. And once language shifts, so does perception. Science provided a vocabulary that sounded neutral, even noble. Terms like prevention, purification, and research masked intentions that might otherwise have seemed unthinkable. Human beings were slowly transformed into something else. They were no longer people, they were data. At the center of this story stands Shiro Ishii, a brilliant and deeply ambitious medical officer in the Japanese army. Ishii was not an outsider. He was educated, articulate, and politically astute. He believed passionately that biological warfare could determine the future of modern conflict. More importantly, he knew how to persuade those in power. Ishii argued that Japan needed its own advanced research programs to rival Western nations. He presented his ideas as defensive, scientific, and necessary. Behind closed doors, his vision was far more expansive. By the mid-1930s, Ishii had secured approval to establish a secret research facility in Japanese-occupied Manchuria. Officially, it was known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, a name designed to reassure, to sound benevolent, to avoid suspicion. In reality, it would later be remembered as Unit 731. The location was carefully chosen, remote, isolated, far from public scrutiny. What happened there was never meant to be known. It is tempting to imagine Unit 731 as a place filled only with monsters, but the truth is more uncomfortable. Many who worked there were educated professionals, doctors trained in respected universities, researchers who believed in science, progress, and order. They followed protocols. They recorded observations carefully. They discussed outcomes in calm, academic language. Within internal reports, there were no screams, no emotional reactions, only measurements. Subjects were not referred to as people. They were called logs, a term that stripped identity away completely. This was not chaos, it was routine. Experiments were scheduled, data was collected, results were analyzed. When suffering is transformed into procedure, it becomes easier to ignore. Responsibility was fragmented. One person designed the experiment, another carried it out, another recorded the results. No single individual felt fully accountable. And when authority validates the system, obedience begins to feel like virtue. Unit 731 did not function because of cruelty alone. It functioned because of organization, because institutions rewarded compliance, because questioning orders was seen as weakness, and because scientific success was valued above ethical reflection. In this environment, morality did not vanish overnight. It eroded, quietly, methodically, until it was no longer visible at all. Before we go any further, we need to pause. Because up to this point, we have spoken about Unit 731 in abstract terms, about systems, ideology, and obedience. But abstraction can soften reality, and reality, in this case, was anything but soft. What happened inside Unit 731 was not rumor, it was not metaphor, it was documented, recorded, and in many cases, carefully measured. The challenge is not whether to speak of it, but how. So instead of listing horrors, we will look at a few specific practices, not to shock, but to understand how science lost its conscience. Example 1. Experiments without the concept of treatment. In conventional medicine, experiments exist to heal. There is a hypothesis, a method, and an intention to reduce suffering. Inside Unit 731, the intention was different. Prisoners were deliberately infected with diseases such as plague, cholera, and typhoid, not to test cures, but to observe progression. No anesthesia was used, not because it was unavailable, but because pain was considered an unwanted variable. Subjects were monitored as symptoms worsened, temperature, pulse, organ failure, all carefully logged. When death approached, some were dissected while still alive, so that organs could be observed before decay altered the data. What matters here is not the brutality alone, but the mindset behind it. These were not impulsive acts. They were scheduled, approved, written into research plans.
The question this raises is unsettling. At what point does observation become participation, and when does documentation turn into complicity? Example 2. The body as a testing ground, not a human being. Another category of experiments focused on physical limits. Human bodies were exposed to extreme cold to study frostbite, particularly relevant to soldiers fighting in northern climates. Limbs were submerged in freezing water until ice formed. The process continued until the skin hardened and movement ceased. Researchers then tested various methods of rewarming, sometimes hot water, sometimes fire, sometimes nothing at all. What is often overlooked is how this was described in reports, not as suffering, not as injury, but as response data. The human body was no longer a person experiencing pain. It was a material reacting to stimulus. And this reframing made everything permissible. Because once someone is reduced to a variable, empathy becomes irrelevant. Example 3. Crossing lines that medicine never should. Perhaps the most revealing experiments were those with no plausible medical justification at all. Blood from animals was transfused into human subjects, not as emergency treatment, not as innovation, but simply to observe what would happen. Organs were removed to see how long a body could survive without them. Limbs were amputated, then reattached in different configurations to study circulation.
These actions did not emerge from desperation or battlefield chaos. They emerged from curiosity. Curiosity unchecked by ethics. And this is where Unit 731 becomes most disturbing, because curiosity is not inherently evil. It is the engine of science. But when curiosity is detached from moral responsibility, it becomes dangerous in ways that violence alone never could. Why this matters more than the details. It is easy to hear these examples and conclude that Unit 731 was filled with monsters. That conclusion is comforting, because monsters are rare. And if monsters are rare, then the problem feels distant. But Unit 731 was staffed by educated professionals, people who wrote papers, people who taught students, people who returned to normal lives after the war. The real horror is not that these experiments happened. It is that they were justified through language, hierarchy, and the belief that responsibility belonged elsewhere. This is why these examples matter, not to horrify us, but to remind us how easily harm can be reframed as duty and cruelty as research. And once that transformation occurs, the line between science and atrocity disappears quietly, without alarms, without resistance, and often without guilt. After hearing what happened inside Unit 731, one might expect the story to end with exposure, with trials, with accountability, with the world confronting what had been done. But that is not how this chapter ends, because when the war ended, something else began. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. Cities lay in ruins. Empires collapsed, and the world turned its attention to rebuilding, politically, economically, strategically. In this moment of global reorganization, Unit 731 did not become a headline. It became a secret. As Soviet forces advanced into Manchuria, Many facilities were destroyed, documents burned, equipment dismantled, test subjects executed to erase evidence. The physical traces of Unit 731 were scattered, but the knowledge remained. And knowledge, in the aftermath of war, was power. The question facing the victors was not purely moral, it was strategic. The data produced by Unit 731 on biological weapons, human endurance, disease transmission, had been obtained through methods the world publicly condemned, but the results themselves were considered valuable. So a decision was made, not announced, not debated in public, an unspoken deal. Key figures involved in Unit 731 were offered immunity in exchange for their research. No international trial, no Nuremberg-style reckoning. Instead, files were transferred, testimony was taken behind closed doors, and many of those responsible returned to civilian life. Some became professors, some held positions in pharmaceutical companies, some shaped post-war medical institutions. And for decades, their pasts remained officially unacknowledged. This silence was not accidental. It was constructed. Governments chose stability over justice, progress over accountability, and in doing so, they buried not only crimes, but questions. The victims of Unit 731 were never formally recognized, their names rarely recorded, their families left without answers. History moved forward, but it did so unevenly. What makes this silence particularly unsettling is not just who benefited from it, but how ordinary it became. No dramatic cover-ups, no shadowy cabals, just classified documents, just decisions labeled necessary, just the quiet agreement that some truths were inconvenient. And once something is inconvenient, it becomes easy to forget. This is where Unit 731 stops being a story about the past and becomes a story about systems. Because silence is not the absence of sound, it is the presence of choice. Someone decides what is spoken. Someone decides what is archived. Someone decides what is remembered. And in this case, silence was chosen not because the truth was unknown, but because it was known too well. There is a temptation to believe that justice delayed is still justice waiting. But in reality, justice delayed often becomes justice denied. As years passed, witnesses aged, memories faded, records disappeared. By the time Unit 731 entered public discussion decades later, many of those involved were already gone, and the silence had done its work. This leads us to a more uncomfortable realization. The end of violence does not guarantee the beginning of truth. War can end, but moral reckoning can be postponed indefinitely. And when it is postponed long enough, it reshapes how history is told, not as a confrontation with wrongdoing, but as a footnote. Unit 731 was not erased because it lacked importance. It was erased because acknowledging it would have required too many powerful institutions to ask difficult questions about themselves. And those questions remain unanswered. This silence becomes the bridge to the most troubling part of the story. Because if atrocities can be committed in the name of science and then quietly absorbed into history without consequence, what does that say about how responsibility truly works? And if obedience,
expertise, and usefulness can shield individuals from accountability, then where exactly does judgment belong? These are not questions about Japan alone. They are not questions about the 1940s. They are questions about any society that places progress above conscience. And it is here, in this quiet aftermath, that Unit 731 delivers its final lesson, not through what was done, but through what was allowed to fade away.
Unit 731 challenges us in ways that go beyond history. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality, that extraordinary harm does not always require extraordinary hatred. Often it requires only ordinary obedience. The individuals involved were not all sadists. Many believed they were professionals, scientists, servants of a system larger than themselves. They trusted hierarchy. They trusted authority. And most importantly, they trusted that responsibility belonged somewhere else. This diffusion of responsibility is one of humanity's most dangerous habits. When decisions are fragmented, no one feels fully accountable. When morality is outsourced to institutions, individual judgment weakens. And when science operates without ethical restraint, its neutrality becomes an illusion. Science does not ask whether something should be done. It asks only whether it can be done. That question, left unchecked, has appeared throughout history in many forms, not only in wartime laboratories, but in corporations, governments, and systems that prioritize efficiency over humanity. Unit 731 is not an anomaly. It is a warning, a reminder that progress without reflection can quietly become destruction. The story of Unit 731 is not meant to leave you angry. Anger fades. What this story asks for instead is awareness. Because history does not repeat itself through identical events, but through familiar patterns, through the belief that outcomes matter more than methods, through the assumption that someone else is responsible for drawing the line, through the quiet acceptance of systems that reward results while ignoring consequences. The most disturbing aspect of Unit 731 is not confined to a place or a time. It lives in the question it leaves behind. When knowledge advances faster than conscience, who decides where the line is drawn? And when no one does, how far are we willing to go before we realize that the cost was never abstract? Thank you for listening. This has been The Myth Echoes. And this was a story meant to be remembered, not for what it shows us about the past, but for what it demands of the present.